tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
So when the government talks about regulating so-called online harms, what they're talking about doing is regulating a different aspect of things that in most cases are already illegal. And why that's so dangerous in the context of its attack on hate speech is that we already have a criminal code definition of hate speech, which has a very, very high bar, because we realize that free speech is supposed to be expansive and liberal and cover contentious, offensive, difficult, and even emotionally hateful things. So when the government is talking about regulating and banning hate speech, they're actually talking about lowering that threshold. And that brings us to this online harms bill. Now, the caveat here, we have not yet seen the bill itself. We haven't seen the text of it, but we have seen former versions of this, and we know where the government has drawn its inspiration from. And the line they used when they tried to reintroduce Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act in 2019 or 2021, it was rather, was that speech that is fomenting detestation or vilification. Now, they try to say this doesn't mean we're tackling free speech. It doesn't mean we're censoring. It just means if your speech that's if you're purveying speech that's doing that, it's going to fall under this banner. Now, we have a bunch of history from the Canadian Human Rights Commission of going after speech that any reasonable person should look at as being worth protecting, not because we agree with it, but because we agree with the fundamental and inalienable, we're supposed to believe anyway, principle of free speech, and in the Canadian legal context and terminology, freedom of expression. So let's talk about this in a bit more detail. John Carpay is the president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms and joins me now. And I should just clarify for those tuning in, I am on the board of the JCCF, although that has no bearing on my decision to invite John, who I have had on the show many times before he works for me, which I guess is technically true, but not really. John, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Glad to be with you, Andrew.
So this is an example, again, put the necessary, caveats out of the way. We haven't yet seen the bill, but we've heard the government describe it, and we know what the government wants to do here. And for a civil liberties organization, you must be looking at that saying, this is the ball game, right?
It sounds like a step in the wrong direction. As you pointed out just a minute ago, it is already illegal to willfully promote hatred online, as it is with a hard copy pamphlet, brochure, newspaper, what have you. So it's already a criminal offense to willfully promote hatred against a group based on race, religion, ancestry, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, gender expression, and so on and so forth. And that was upheld very narrowly by the Supreme Court of Canada. It was a 4-3 split decision. So that's already illegal. So what I see here is the government stepping towards, it's a small step towards becoming a repressive regime. And one of the hallmarks of repressive regimes, whether it's today's communist China, communist North Korea, whether it's Germany, Italy, Spain in the 1930s, whether it's the theocracies that are running Iran and Saudi Arabia, one thing they all have in common is they all censor, and the governments take it upon themselves to determine what is true or false, right or wrong, good or evil. And they will censor in the name of the public interest and the common good, because politicians never violate your rights and freedoms without offering some pretext. They're going to tell you it's national security, it's fighting communism, it's fighting fascism, it's the environment, it's fighting a virus. There's always a pretext for taking away our rights and freedoms. So this really looks like a step in the wrong direction.
One of the things I want to, not to put you on the spot here, but I'm curious about your take on it, because the government has said in the past that its definition of hate speech is going to be informed by the Watcott Supreme Court decision from some years back, which we don't need to get into the details of the case. But the Supreme Court has not in Canada always taken the strongest view on freedom of expression. And I want to read a line from this particular Supreme Court decision. Truthful statements can be presented in a manner that would meet the definition of hate speech, and not all truthful statements must be free from restriction. That is a very dangerous line that the government is embedding in its approach to freedom of expression, which is that something can be true, but you aren't allowed to say it.
Well, the Watcott decision weakened prior Supreme Court Supreme Court of Canada jurisprudence on free speech that was better. It was not a good decision. It could have been a lot worse. The problem with hate speech regulation or even laws against it is that hate is an emotion that is in the human heart. It is subjective. It is not necessarily a bad thing if it's directed against injustice or oppression or falsehoods. If you hate injustice, then hatred can be a good thing. But the problem with laws or regulations trying to govern hate is simply the fact that it's very subjective. I could be listening to somebody. I could suspect that they might have hatred in their heart. I really don't know. You or I could be giving a speech, and some of your listeners might subjectively feel that your speech is hateful. Other people listening to the exact same speech think it's not hateful. It's just the expression of an opinion. So, rightly or wrongly, we've got the law on the books to criminalize willful promotion of hatred. We shouldn't go any further down the road of having governments regulate the internet and take away from the right of Canadians to have full access to information and to a diversity of viewpoints.
Well, and that exchange is so paramount. I mean, just to use a contemporary example, I started off this show by talking about this back and forth between, Israel and Hamas about what happened in this hospital attack yesterday. And, a bunch of people that are very sympathetic to the Hamas cause are saying one thing happened. It's only through the exchange of these conflicts that we can interrogate and find out what the truth is. And I'd say in that case, I mean, I would even say false statements are protected free speech in some contexts because it is through the falsity that you can then establish the truth oftentimes. And it's really dangerous to me that government is trying to take that decision and take that process out of the hands of free people, because that's really what they're doing here. They're making the Canadian Human Rights Commission the arbiter of what you can and cannot say, and by extension, deputizing tech companies to do that, because that's the other part of regulating online harms, is that it provides a vehicle for government to go to Facebook and say, you shouldn't allow so-and-so to say that. You shouldn't allow so-and-so to post that.
Well, we've seen in the last 3.5 years that governments are very, very effective at getting millions of private actors, of private citizens to enforce government laws. You saw that with the lockdowns and the vaccine passports, where the government didn't need to hire, although they probably did hire a lot more people, but they didn't need to necessarily hire thousands of health inspectors, because every movie theater owner, every gym operator, every restaurant manager was an enforcement tool for the government to enforce these rules. And so this is what the government seems to be moving towards, is to regulate these big platforms. And then they don't have to spend time, effort, or energy trying to shut down the Andrew Lawton Show or the weekly Justice with John podcast, because these big entities will do it for the government. You mentioned even false speech should be protected, and there's Supreme Court authority on that, yes. Part of that, one aspect of that is we don't even know if a statement is true or false until after it's been investigated and debated, and you've got 2 or 3 or 4 different opinions and they clash, and we look at the evidence. So even a law that says, we're making false statements illegal, that we did have a law in the criminal code that was struck down in the Zundel decision. It was illegal in Canada, criminal code offense, to spread false news. And the Supreme Court struck that down and said, no, we don't even know what's false until after we've had the debate. Another interesting point is that this is troublesome from Watcott, from that decision, where even a true statement could be hateful and could be illegal. The Criminal Code of Canada, in criminalizing the willful promotion of hatred, says expressly that truth is a defense. So if you made some nasty comment about some group based on skin color, gender, whatever, if that statement happened to be true, that would actually be a defense in a criminal prosecution. Sounds like it's not going to be a defense when the human rights bodies get involved.
Yeah, and that's the big danger, is all of a sudden we're taking a lower evidentiary threshold, and also it's a civil proceeding. So then you add the burden of proof aspect changes from criminal as well, and the stakes are very high for people who will get their lives dragged through the ringer. We've seen what happens when these human rights commissions have had free reign, like the Alberta Human Rights Commission going after Ezra Levant and the BC Tribunal going after Mark Stein. And to go back to something I've talked about on the show in the past, but kind of just was swept in very quietly in Canada. And I think it was the last federal budget or 2 years ago, they reintroduced a criminal provision banning Holocaust denial. And I think this is probably the perfect example of where the free speech discussions go off the rails, because I will say on principled free speech grounds, I oppose this. I find Holocaust denial to be deplorable and wrong, but I do not think it should be illegal. But the government will often use the emotional reactions people have to certain speech as a way to really, as a cudgel to justify banning it, in the same way as that Mike Ward case in Quebec, where, yes, it's difficult to stand up and say, I defend making fun of disabled 12-year-olds, but it's not that I defend the act of doing it, it's I defend the right to do it.
Yeah. Well, that's where the rubber hits the road. Incidentally, I find the Holocaust denial to be vile speech. It disgusts me and it outrages me. And I actually testified at a parliamentary committee to not amend the criminal code regarding Holocaust denial. And the only reason for that is because the government should not be in the business of determining historical truth or falsehood, period. It's not the role of the state. And once you have the government doing that on one issue, it grows like a cancer. The other interesting thing is that the groups lining up so far, this is from a CBC story that I read the other day, the Center for Israeli and Jewish Affairs and the National Council of Canadian Muslims and the Chinese Canadian National Council, according to this story, want legislation to regulate and then arguably punish if you violate the regulation, to regulate and punish websites and new emerging platforms. And if we go down this road, if we take any step here, the number of groups lining up, what's going to happen is instead of just engaging in debate and explaining, using facts and logic and evidence, instead of making your case and trying to persuade people, instead of engaging in debate, you're going to see more and more groups lining up, going to government and trying to get the government to shut up their opponents. And that's fascism in practice.
Yeah, and that's the other part of this, is that even if you fundamentally agree, which I don't, and I don't gather you do as well, that there should be a limit to protect against hateful speech that is lower than the threshold now. The logical question is, who do you trust to be the authority to determine that? And that is where we get, this is a government, and I don't like going back to this, but this is a government that froze its political protesters' bank accounts. Like, this is not a government that I trust with the switch to censor people's opinions and to censor people's expression of those opinions.
And it's broader than that. There's a lot of people applaud. I remember once I saw a video clip, Bill Watcott, very outspoken social conservative activist who articulates his viewpoint in ways that most social conservatives don't even like it. But, he's got his free speech rights. I saw him get arrested and handcuffed. This is about 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. He was at the University of Saskatchewan or University of Regina, I forget which. And he was handing out pamphlets on campus and critical of homosexual behavior. And he was arrested and handcuffed and taken off campus in a police car. And the group of students applauded. And I thought to myself, you are very short-sighted, because what if there is this massive religious revival in Canada and 2/3 of Canadians are fervent, believing, devout Muslims, Christians, Orthodox Jews, whatever? Would these same students want a fundamentalist religious government to have the power to censor their speech? They don't think about that, but they should.
Yeah, very, very well said. John Carpay, president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Always a pleasure, John. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.